Hi, and welcome to Why Do Countries Exist, Episode 34, The History of Cape Verde. So I tried to find a drink from Cape Verde, but I'd have to ship them from across the country, and it costs like $80 for a single bottle, so I decided to make bolinos de mandioca con mel, or little balls of manioca with honey. It's supposed to be a dessert sort of treat that you bake into small little balls. I, however, have no experience baking, and the recipe I used was in Portuguese, a language I do not speak, so I completely failed in making them. I tried to salvage it by turning the dough I created into cookies, which weren't awful, but they weren't really that good. Easily the biggest L I've had so far in trying to make something for the podcast. But you want to know what isn't an L? The Republic of Cape Verde. I'm just trying to make up for butchering the bolinos. Cape Verde, also sometimes referred to as Cabo Verde, the Portuguese name for the islands, is located in the Atlantic Ocean off the coast of West Africa, with Senegal and Mauritania a couple hundred miles east of it. Meanwhile, if you travel west of Cape Verde, you will eventually reach Caribbean island nations like Dominica and St. Lucia. Cape Verde is an archipelago of around a dozen islands and smaller keys, with 9 of them being inhabited. The islands in the east tend to be flatter and more arid-like, while the remaining islands are more mountainous and slightly wetter. Cape Verde has a little over 500,000 people in the country. Most of the people on the islands are mixed to a certain extent between African peoples like the Wolof, Fula, Manjaca, Mandinka, and Balante peoples, and Europeans such as the Portuguese, Italians, and French. Notably, there are around 1 million people of Cape Verdean descent who live outside the islands, which we'll talk about later in the episode. The official language of Cape Verde is Portuguese, owing to Portugal's long rule on the island. Many people will, however, speak a Creole language known as Creole, Kriolu. Creole is a hybrid of Portuguese and various African languages. Apparently, the grammar of Creole is considered pretty different than Portuguese, and each island will have their own version of the language. Finally, religion-wise, most people in the country are Catholic, with a little less than 80% being Catholic. Other religious groups have started to emerge more recently, with other Christian groups like Protestants gaining more ground in the past 100 years. These groups include Mormons, Seventh-day Adventists, Nazarenes, and several evangelical groups. There also are smaller numbers of Muslims and Baha'is. The remaining population holds no real religion, but there are relatively few atheists in the country. So it seems official histories of Cape Verde say that before the 1450s, no humans lived on the islands. Wikipedia, the Cape Verdean Museum in Rhode Island, and South Africa History Online, SAHO, all say that the Portuguese claimed the islands were uninhabited when they first encountered them. However, the SAHO and Basil Davidson both note that oral legends state that West African and Arab fishermen knew of the islands. Humans settling on the islands seems unlikely, although not necessarily impossible. Regardless, it seems most likely Cape Verde was unaltered or altered very little by humans before the 16th century. The Portuguese, as stated previously, found the islands in the 1450s and started settling the islands in 1462. Histories of the island like to make a big deal of this date because it means Cape Verde was one of the first European colonies and was the first European colony in a tropical climate / in sub-Saharan Africa. Cape Verde's economy and population would at first stagnate and then grow rapidly. Plantations were set up and starting in 1472 were worked on by slaves brought over from Africa. While plantations and agricultural products like sugar, rum, cotton, maize, beans, and bananas would play a role in Cape Verde's economy really until today, agriculture never really was the moneymaker for the islands. Cape Verde's dry and quasi-arid climate just quite frankly isn't suited to large-scale agriculture. Fishing and shepherding would also be economic industries started up in the colony's early days, but these again were not massively profitable or widespread, and fishing in particular is much more substance-based. Cape Verde would, however, grow because of slavery. As demand for slaves in New World colonies began to grow, slavers would often use Cape Verde, located off the African coast and near the North Equatorial Current, as a stopping point for ships to refuel before they transported their human cargo to the Americas. Cape Verde's role as a trading point would also see the islands grow rich. While most slaves were forced to visit the islands and didn't stay long, some would remain working in the plantations as servants or in some other industry. According to the Cape Verdean Museum, the island of Santiago in 1510 had only 15% of its population enslaved on an island of less than 200. Meanwhile, in 1580, over 85% of the population was enslaved on an island of 16,000. Santiago would eventually become the island with the largest population, and today around half the country lives on just this one island. Cape Verde would also grow due to Jewish immigration to the islands, as Jews in Iberia were expelled by the Spanish monarchs and forced to go to Portugal's Atlantic colonies. Cape Verde became more and more connected to the slave trade as the 16th century came along. Cape Verde's slaves came primarily from West Africa, and many from specifically what is now Guinea-Bissau, as that was also being colonized by the Portuguese at the same time. They came from a variety of different ethnic groups. Many of these people brought with them a variety of different cultural and linguistic practices, and would mix these with the Portuguese influence they were introduced to on the islands. Intermingling and intermixing would become very common. By the 1800s, their Creole language would become the dominant language in unofficial conversations. Cape Verde's wealth wouldn't go unnoticed by other European powers, however. Rivals of Portugal would send privateers to raid ships off the island, or even the islands themselves. Some famous examples include the French attacking the islands for the first time ever in 1537, English privateer Francis Drake capturing the island of Santiago for a brief period in 1585, French privateer Jacques Cassard again attacking Santiago, sacking the city in 1712, and taking most of the city's gold, and then in the American Revolution, a British fleet resupplying in Santiago was attacked by a French fleet. These attacks, while they never destroyed the colony, did hurt the economy of the islands and forced the Portuguese to invest more in the defense of the islands. The island's suffering wouldn't come primarily from rivals to Portugal, but mainly from nature itself. Cape Verde is geologically a series of volcanoes, and throughout Cape Verde's history, these volcanoes have erupted, often causing destruction and forcing people to leave the islands. However, the big disruptor for Cape Verde would have to be famines. Cape Verde's dry climate means droughts aren't uncommon. As Cape Verde's population increased, the islands were put on more and more strain. The Portuguese also growing cash crops that couldn't really be eaten, like sugar or cotton, often treating the islands as an afterthought, especially as the centuries went on, and raids from privateers all helped create the conditions for famines. In the 1700s alone, around 5 different famines would occur, with a famine in 1773 resulting in almost half of the island's population dying. Cape Verde's problems would become worse in the 1800s. As Western countries began banning the slave trade and eventually freed their slaves, Cape Verde's role as an important trading point declined, and thus the economy became much worse. This led to Portugal to care less and less about the islands, seeing them as a backwater and decrease the number of supplies sent to the islands. More famines would take place in the mid-19th century. A slave revolt would occur in 1853, that resulted in slavery being abolished on the islands themselves several years later, in 1868, and discontent with the Portuguese grew. Cape Verde didn't completely cease being a stopping point though. Its location in the mid-Atlantic meant that various ships would visit its ports every year, and increasingly more and more of these ships would be American whaling ships, hunting for whales in the South Atlantic. Many of these ships would stop in Cape Verde, and while there, often picked up Cape Verdean men who wanted to leave the poverty of the islands. Many of these men, after their whaling expedition was over, would find their way to New England, and over the years, a large Cape Verdean community would spring up in that region of the US. Even today, states like Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut have tens of thousands of people with Cape Verdean descent. Remember, the Cape Verdean Museum I mentioned earlier is located in Rhode Island. This large diaspora was also located in places like Portugal, the Netherlands, France, Argentina, Angola, Senegal, and, importantly for later, Guinea-Bissau. Cape Verde also during this time would modernize. More cities were established across the archipelago, and the population grew. More modern technology was brought in, and new industries came over. Coffee and salt mining would be the 2 largest new industries brought to the islands, and it was hoped that this might bring some prosperity to the islands. However, neither of these industries really took off, and Cape Verde continued to be reliant on serving as a fueling station and a midway point. The economy wasn't always terrible, but most Cape Verdeans certainly weren't wealthy. Cape Verde nationalists emerged for 4 primary reasons. Firstly, even in the 18th century, Cape Verdeans were beginning to develop an almost proto-leftist understanding of the colonial system. According to Davidson, a saying began to emerge that roughly translates into, quote, "They'll pay you to climb up the coconut palm tree to collect nuts, but getting down again, that's your affair." This means that Cape Verdeans believed that they were getting paid to collect the nuts, but they were not getting the full value of their work, and the profits were being taken by the Portuguese. However, even with this, many Cape Verdean proto-revolutionaries were liberals, believing in enlightened colonialism. However, in 1926, the Estado Novo, a far-right corporatist government, took power in Portugal. This government attempted to integrate Portugal's colonies and turn places like Cape Verde from a colony to a overseas province. with colonized people who were educated being given citizenship. Cape Verde did have more schools and access to education than Portugal's other colonies, but still, it was difficult to actually be on equal footing with the Portuguese. This led many Cape Verdean revolutionaries in a more radical direction. Thirdly, World War II would lead to more tension with the Portuguese. While Cape Verde never experienced any invasions or warring armies, the Portuguese would send more troops into the colony to reinforce it in case war began. While many of these Portuguese soldiers were, quite frankly, rude and racist towards the Cape Verdeans, leading to further tension and a growing sense of otherness among the Cape Verdeans. Finally, the fourth reason was famine in the 40s. Almost 50,000 people either died or left the country in the 40s, devastating the islands and leaving many parts of the country depopulated. The Estado Novo's reaction was, to put nicely, lackluster, only sending relief in 1960, 12 years after the famine was over. Economic exploitation, the far-right government in Portugal, occupying troops, and famine all helped create Cape Verdean nationalists, which started to emerge in the mid-20th century. By the 1950s, an independence movement was beginning to take shape. Cape Verde's independence movement was also closely associated with the independence movement of Guinea-Bissau. Many Cape Verdeans had connections to Guinea-Bissau, since for a while both colonies were administratively linked. Notably, many Cape Verdeans served as low-level bureaucrats within Guinea-Bissau's colonial administration. One of these bureaucrats would be Amilcar Cabral. Cabral, who today is revered as a national hero, was a Cape Verdean who would eventually go on to found with several other Cape Verdean and Bissau Guineans the African Party for the Independence of Guinea and Cape Verde, or PAIGC, in 1956. The PAIGC was a Marxist-inspired party in the vein of other left-wing anti-colonial movements in Africa, like the MPLA in Angola or the CPP in Ghana. Cabral and the PAIGC would start preparing for guerrilla war to remove the Portuguese from power, and made many close connections with villagers in the Guinean interior. However, once the Portuguese colonial war began in 1962, Cape Verde was for the most part spared from the violence. The PAIGC's guerrilla war would have been very difficult to carry out on Cape Verde, with a small population spread throughout several different islands. Instead, Guinea-Bissau was where the PAIGC would fight the Portuguese, managing to take many parts of the interior of the colony. In 1973, Cabral was killed by a rival within the PAIGC, with possibly the help of the Portuguese secret police. However, the PAIGC would ultimately be successful in liberating Cape Verde and Guinea-Bissau, with the Carnation Revolution overthrowing the Estado Novo in 1974, and Portugal giving up its colonies. While the PAIGC had won, there would be some opposition in Cape Verde to their rule initially. Several political organizations opposed a merger with Guinea-Bissau, and others even argued for Cape Verde to join a federation with a new Portuguese republic. While these movements were quickly swept away because, quite frankly, they had very little support and were seen to be tools of the Portuguese, Cape Verde didn't immediately join Guinea-Bissau. Although both were led by the PAIGC, which operated in both countries, and the Guinea-Bissau president, Luis Cabral, was a Cape Verdean and brother to Amilcar, both territories would emerge as separate independent nations. It seems many in Cape Verde weren't entirely on board for joining Guinea-Bissau. In 1980, a coup in Guinea-Bissau overthrew Luis Cabral, and this ultimately ended any chance for unification, and the PAIGC in Cape Verde broke off and formed the African Party for Independence of Cape Verde, or PAICV. The PAICV, a socialist-inspired party, led the country somewhat similar to how other Marxist parties around the world organized their states. The PAICV was the only legal party allowed to operate in the country, and criticism of the government was monitored. It also promoted broadly more left-wing economics, invested heavily into ensuring public goods were made available, land reform was carried out, built more infrastructure, family planning and women's empowerment were promoted, and they tried to improve education and literacy among the island's poor. However, the PAICV never fell directly into the Soviet bloc. Since Cape Verde was, and still is, a country very reliant on foreign aid, trade, and business, it tried to maintain friendly relations with most other countries, serving almost as a bridge between the Soviets and the West. It also did allow some opposition, including those right of the PAICV to get elected as independents, and allowing a Trotskyist breakup of the PAICV to form, and did hold local assemblies where those who were upset with the system could voice their concerns. After the fall of the Soviet Union, the PAICV, both wanting to present a more democratic image on the world stage and facing pressure at home, decided to end one-party rule on the islands, and allowed in 1991 opposition parties to run. Since then, Cape Verde has mostly been dominated by two political parties, the PAICV, which is moderated slightly into a more social democratic party, but still the party of the left, and the Movement for Democracy, or MPD, which serves as liberal opposition to them. The MPD, which ran the country from 1991 to 2001, promoted free market reforms and opened up the economy more. Overall, democracy on the islands is pretty stable, with no major examples of political violence in recent years. There's so far been an interesting pattern of the MPD and the PAICV switching off who controls the presidency every 10 years. Currently, the president is PAICV member José Maria Neves. He was elected in 2021 and has argued for less partisanship in the country, more spending on transport and infrastructure between the islands, more funds being given to the presidential office, and wants to protect Cape Verdeans' health. Cape Verde is often noted as being one of the more developed countries in Africa, and having a higher standard of living than most other places on the continent. Its population is highly literate owing to the education system there, its HDI is higher than most other countries in West Africa, its life expectancy has been increasing and its infant mortality rate decreasing since independence, and as stated previously, live in a fairly stable and peaceful democracy. This is all despite the fact that Cape Verde has few natural resources. Instead, Cape Verde relies on tourism, which has been increasing as infrastructure has improved and more people have learned about the beauty of the islands, along with Cape Verdeans living abroad sending money back to their homeland. However, a big problem with this economic model is that it's very reliant on those outside the country. If the world's economy isn't as good, then less people will visit the islands, and the diaspora will probably make less money, so therefore can't send as much money home. Cape Verde also experiences poverty and crime like pretty much all countries, especially in inner city slums. Famines and volcanic eruptions are possible in the country's future, and corruption is present in the country, although again, not on the level of some other countries in Africa. And then finally, one interesting social debate that I've seen a bit while researching is the racial/identity question. Are Cape Verdeans African, or are they their own unique people different from both Africa and Europe? While I am not Cape Verdean, so I'm not going to pretend to fully understand the debate, it seems a growing number of Cape Verdeans today are pushing for more and more of a recognition within Cape Verde of the population's African roots. In particular, it wants to fight against colorism in Cape Verdean society, where those with lighter skin and more European features are treated better than those with darker skin and more African features, and calls for an end to self-hatred. If you are curious more on the debate, I'll recommend an article, To Be African in Cape Verde is Taboo, by João Jorge Henriquez, which goes a lot more into the discussion around this debate. So why does Cape Verde exist? Cape Verde's unique position in Micronesia, but also close to the African continent, means its history is unlike any other in the region. Its official history, which only began a relatively short time ago, and its mixing of different peoples, have created the culture and the people of Cape Verde today. While it could have joined together with Guinea-Bissau, differences led to them to be independent, and where they are today. Up next, we will go to the Central African Republic. Prepare for the French, an eccentric emperor, and civil war. Thanks for listening, thanks for watching. Hopefully, everyone's at least a little bit interested in African history, because we'll be talking about it a little bit. After the Central African Republic, we'll also talk about the history of Chad, which is actually right next to the Central African Republic, so prepare yourself for African history. I'm just hoping I'll be able to find books for those, because my college discovered that I graduated, so now I'm locked out of my my library account for my college, and Z Library was taken down by the US government, so I've had to resort to going to my local library, which I'm not 100% sure how good their history section is, but we'll see. But it had something for Cape Verde, so that gives me a little bit of hope that they'll also have stuff for plenty of other countries. Before we talk about the history of the Central African Republic, we will take a look at Turkish political parties. I've started working on that script. Should be out relatively soon. And then I will talk about Danish political parties, and then I will talk about the Central African Republic. So yeah, hope you enjoyed this history of Cape Verde. Part of me is wishing I was in Cape Verde right now, because right now it's 21 degrees out. 21 degrees Fahrenheit for Americans. Point is, it's very, very cold. I would enjoy being in a warm place right now. But yeah, thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. If you want, you can email me at whydocountries@gmail.com for your thoughts, comments, suggestions, or hate mail. Take care. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. So the sources I used are the 2001 documentary Amilcar Cabral, Boulah's translation of the Publico article To Be African in Cape Verde is a Taboo, the Cape Verdeans Museum's page History, Basil Davidson's book The Fortunate Islands, Geography Now's video on Cape Verde, Home Team History's video on the history of the Cape Verdean people, IMCVBP video on Cape Verdean identity crisis, Mesa Man's video Who Are the Macronesians, Mr. History's video on the history of Cape Verde, PAICV's page on the party's history, RFI's article,
Presidente José Maria Neves deixa duras críticas ao governo e aos políticos de Cabo Verde.
The Roots video, Black America's Connections to the African Nation of Cape Verde, South Africa History Online's page on Cape Verde, and Wikipedia.